Leonardo da Vinci, his great predecessor and still contemporary. Leonardo was still alive when Raphael was painting the School of Athens. And you can see he gets a pretty good likeness of Leonardo. So here is Leonardo, the great elder artist, as Plato, someone who has Cephalus say at the beginning of the Republic, quote, "Old age has a great sense of peace and freedom." But we won't be looking at any other works by Leonardo today, because Leonardo would only live for a few more years. And I had to come up with a cutoff. If I'm talking about elder artists in the history of art, 66, that's not quite good enough. That's what Rembrandt got to. That's what Leonardo, 66, 67. I decided to make my cutoff 70. And so we will be looking at artists that lived and worked and prospered past the age of 70. Now, I know that today 70 is young, but for a lot of the period that we are talking about, 70 was a grand old age. So Raphael didn't make it by a long shot. Leonardo didn't make it, but their great contemporary and rival Michelangelo did. Oh, and where you see the parentheses, that is the approximate age of the artist when he created the work that is on the screen. So this is Michelangelo's Jeremiah on the Sistine ceiling. And this is a self-portrait. You may be thinking, wait, that man is not 35 to 37 with that hoary white beard. Well, it is an artificially aged self-portrait, but he is wearing the same doeskin boots that this figure wears. Can I do this? Can you all see? Nope, that doesn't work in this screen. So this is Raphael's portrait of Michelangelo. So this is what Michelangelo actually looked like as a 35 to 37-year-old. That figure right there. But notice those soft boots that he is wearing. Raphael did this as an homage to the painter of the Sistine ceiling, who, according to Michelangelo, taught Raphael everything he knew, because Raphael sneaked into the ceiling. Oh, yes, thank you. I forgot I had that option. Brilliant. Yay, I don't have to walk to all three screens. So there's Michelangelo in 1511, because this is the absolute last thing Raphael paints on this fresco. Raphael chips away the plaster to add this portrait of Michelangelo, this homage to Michelangelo. So that's a very, very aged Michelangelo, painted, of course, by Michelangelo himself. But Michelangelo was one of those people who was never young. Michelangelo was complaining about his rheumatism in his 20s. He was, the fact that he ages himself in this portrait is just so psychologically appropriate for him. He considered himself to be old. He complained about his old age for many years. But unlike Raphael, he didn't die at 37. He would continue to have a very long life, a very long career, primarily as a sculptor. But in his 80s, he becomes perhaps the most creative architect of the Renaissance. So he designs projects like this stairway of the vestibule of the Laurentian Library. You have to go up these stairs to access the reading room. And he conceives of this staircase as if it is a sculpture. It is an absolutely novel staircase, the way that it fills the space, the way that it is not purely utilitarian to get you up a couple of flights of stairs, but it is it's sculptural, it is artistic, it is surprising, it sort of flows down through that space. Michelangelo would design at the very end of his life the Porta Pia, this remarkable Roman gate, where he takes the language of classical antiquity. He uses the classical orders, but he transforms them in very, very novel ways. Now, Michelangelo did not consider himself primarily an architect nor a painter, but a sculptor. Carving marble was Michelangelo's be-all and end-all, and he was carving marble into his 70s and 80s. So this was the work that Michelangelo intended to be placed on his own tomb. This is his own memorial, which he worked on for about 5 years in his 70s, until one day we think the hammer slipped. We don't know exactly what happened, but in his rage at having ruined this block of marble, Michelangelo destroyed Jesus's left leg. So can you kind of see that there's a hole there into which a piece of marble was slotted that was Jesus's left leg? He is one-legged in this sculpture. And so Michelangelo abandoned it. And the faces, particularly the face of the Magdalene, was later ham-handedly carved by one of his assistants. But this is a work that was never completed. It never came to fruition as Michelangelo would have had it. So, of course, being Michelangelo at 77, what does he do? He gets another piece of marble, and he starts carving that. And this has been called the most tragic sculpture in the history of art. I recently heard it called Michelangelo's greatest work as his most human work. It is this Pietà, so the same theme as this one is more of a deposition with other figures as well, but this is that same theme as the great youthful sculpture now in the Vatican, the famous Pietà, done more than half a century earlier. But Michelangelo, as he gets into his 80s, he doesn't have the strength and the dexterity to carve marble that he once had. And the figures, instead of being bulky, I mean, it looks like he started the legs first, and then the torsos, the heads are very much unfinished, but they're thin. This is not the imposing Jesus of the Last Supper who looks like a linebacker. This is a really attenuated style. If I told you this were a German expressionist sculpture, you would believe it because it looks so modern and so different. Now, in the 20th century, in the mid-20th century, the artist Kenneth Clark gave a series of lectures, which he then turned into a book on the topic, The Artist Grows Old. And Clark had and Michelangelo was one of the artists that he considered. So was Rembrandt, who doesn't make my cut because he didn't live, out of his 60s. So Clark said, quote, "Let me try to summarize the characteristics of the old age style as they appear with remarkable consistency in the work of the greatest painters and sculptors. A sense of isolation, a feeling of holy rage, developing into what I have called transcendental pessimism. A mistrust of reason, a belief in instinct, and so forth. And the Pietà Rondinini is one of Kenneth Clark's examples to support this argument. But really, at just about any stage in Michelangelo's career, one could accuse him of holy rage and pessimism. He was just that sort of person. And I have found in looking at the work of artists genuinely over 70, something different. And so that is what I hope to explore today. Not just this transcendental pessimism and rage, but something of Plato's peace and freedom. Another of the artists that is a linchpin in Clark's theory is Titian. This is his Pietà, and this too Titian intended to put on his grave. And it too was finished by a follower, his student Palma Giovane. And this is a work that is quite a bit darker than Titian's earlier work. It is less fine in its motor control. It's more what we would call impressionistic, this sort of all over dabs of paint and light. It's very painterly. And Clark says that he also finds in these late works, quote, an impatience with established technique and a craving for a complete unity of treatment, as if the picture were an organism in which every member shared in the life of the whole, end quote. And we can see something of that overall treatment here in the Titian. Now, Titian painted some very moving religious works late in his career, like this one, that are dark but seem to be lit from within. But he was also painting more erotic works. This is one that he did when he was about 50, 48-ish. We do not have a clear birth date for Titian. And by the time he was painting this, when he was about 85, he was claiming to be in his late 90s. Because in his culture, there was some respect afforded the very elderly. So Titian painted nudes his entire life, but they do get less defined, more painterly, more impressionistic, and perhaps more erotic. So this one was painted at about age 63, and this one in his early 70s. And one commentator on this painting said that it would make the Venus of Urbino look like a nun. So these are both the theme of Danae in her tower copulating with Zeus, with the king of the gods. Now, at this point, Titian is painting primarily for Philip II of Spain, for occasionally popes and cardinals, for these very, very powerful people. And this is another work that he paints for Philip II. It is this just glowing work of eroticism. We see Europa carried off on the back of the bull, which is, again, Zeus abusing his power. And he is going to abduct and rape this young woman. But we also see these gorgeous sunset colors. That scarf, that brilliant apricot silk scarf that is reflected in the sunset. We see the putti, images of youth flying around this figure, and the parted legs, the dimpled flesh. It's a really, really sensual image. Now, one of the works that Clark loved for that argument of his about holy rage and pessimism is this late Titian, again on a mythological subject, the flaying of Marsyas. This is a tough painting. The story is that the satyr Marsyas challenged Apollo to a musical duel. This was always a bad idea in classical mythology. Never, ever challenge a god to a duel, particularly in their area of specialty. And hearing Marsyas play on his panpipes, and then hearing Apollo play on the lyre, one of the judges, this one, decided that Marsyas had won, and so Apollo gave him donkey's ears. If you look closely, you can see the donkey's ears. And Apollo, the other judges quickly decided that Apollo had definitely won the contest. And Apollo's prize was to get to do whatever he wanted to do to the satyr. And what he chose to do was to flay him alive. And so that is Apollo here leaning over and carving away the flesh of the satyr who is suspended upside down from a tree. There's a dog lapping up the blood. This is macabre. And yet, Marsyas is not grimacing in pain. He seems peaceful. And Apollo wields that scalpel of his quite like a paintbrush. And so I think, if anything, this is a meditation on the sacrifices that it takes to be an artist. The fact that every visual artist, every painter is vying with the gods every time he or she paints a human figure. That is what is going on in the mind of someone like Titian. A Judeo-Christian God created humankind in his image, mankind in particular. So when Titian paints a man, he's playing God. And that can be dangerous, but also really, really rewarding. So this, yes, it is a macabre scene. I will not deny that. But I think there are undercurrents here about what art is that are very important. Now, as I mentioned, Rembrandt, who only lived until 63, I believe, this is a self-portrait from his very final year, Rembrandt doesn't make our cut, but his contemporary portraitist, Frans Hals, does. Now, this is a portrait that Hals painted at 28. And like the young Rembrandt, Hals was always someone who painted the elderly with respect and made them look like intelligent people that you would want to know, that have a mind of their own. This sitter, Jacobus Zaphius, was 77 at the time of this portrait. But Hals's style went out of fashion late in his life. And he ended up being supported, having a monthly salary paid to him by the old men's almshouse. He wasn't quite reduced to living in the old men's almshouse, but he had a pension. And so he painted the women who ran that charitable institution in Harlem. And these are the regentesses. And they are five women, most of them of a certain age, painted with just incredible sympathy with this artist. These are women who have devoted their twilight years, some of them, and they're non-twilight years. The woman on the left looks quite young, to caring for the very elderly, to making sure that the very elderly live out their life in dignity. And Halls affords exactly that much dignity, the spark in the eye, the intelligence in the gaze of these old women that he portrays in his early 80s. Now, in the 18th century, Jean-Baptiste Simeon Chardin was the best known French painter of still lifes. But in his last years, Chardin would change his medium from oil paint to pastel because it was easier for him to handle, to not have to breathe the fumes of working with pastels. And in 1771, at the age of 72, he exhibited this marvelous self-portrait in which he looks a little bit disgruntled, maybe a little fed up, but maybe just discerning. He shows himself with his painter's cap. He shows himself with the spectacles that he needed now to wield his pastel. And here, 5 years later, he depicts himself again. And I think we might say that his fine motor control may have lessened a little bit in those 5 years. He's now 77, but he still has a marvelous command of his materials. And if you think, well, his eyes look a little big here, it's because they are magnified behind those spectacles. So it's a deliberate distortion. And at the same time that he created this self-portrait with the visor, another tool of his craft, he also painted his wife. And it was his second wife. They had married about 30 years before this. So this is a woman who has grown old with him, and she too, although no longer in the first flush of youth, is still a wonderfully attractive, lively-looking woman. Now, perhaps the greatest pastel painter of the 18th century was Maurice Quentin de la Tour, whose self-portrait we see here. And Delatour painted Madame de Pompadour and Louis XV and all of the greats of the Rococo period. But at the age of 76, he turned his attention to himself. And this is often considered an unfinished pastel. But we're not certain if it's intentionally unfinished or not. Do we see holy rage in Chardin or in de la Tour? No. De la Tour is smiling, and Chardin mellows a bit from 72 to 77. And de la Tour is not only smiling, but he's showing his teeth. No society portrait of this period showed the teeth. I mean, he's grinning. He is not just politely smiling. So this is someone who still, at 76, has a tremendous zest for life. He may have not finished this. He may have only wanted to sketch in the details of his costume and really to focus on the face. And this must have been the visage that he wanted to leave to posterity, not grim and self-satisfied, but grinning. Francisco Goya is an artist that we generally consider to be suffused with pessimism. Goya's caprichos, which skewered the morals of his day, the superstitions, the hypocrisies, were made, though, when Goya was in his 50s. But importantly, before he completed the caprichos, Goya had recently lost his hearing, which is something often associated with old age and with that sense of isolation that Clark talks about. So in this capriccio, this Goya etching about his society, this one is about the marriage market, the auctioning off, essentially, of attractive young women to hideous old men with money. So Goya would work for the crown of Spain virtually his entire career. And then, at the age of 78, he finally started to think, after the Napoleonic Wars and the restoration of the Bourbon monarchs, Goya started to think that his job might not be safe in Spain. And so he asked for permission to take the waters in Bordeaux, and he never went back. So Goya spent the last 4 years of his life, 1824 to 28, when he was 78 to 82, in a foreign country where he did not speak the language and was welcomed by these Spanish expatriates there. But he carried his sketchbook with him everywhere he went and was just fascinated by everything he saw. On the left, an old man on a swing. Very little holy rage in that image. On the right, he's seeing wheelchairs for the first time. Beggars who get around on their own in Bordeaux. He captions that drawing. Now, the technique of lithography had recently been invented in France. And so Goya goes to a lithographer's studio and learns this new printmaking technique. He learns how to make images on limestone that can then be turned into print. So he does a whole series of bullfighting images, one of his favorite motifs going back to his childhood. And my favorite of all Goya's Bordeaux works is this one. It depicts a very elderly man walking around with 2 sticks. And it is probably at least a psychological self-portrait. Whether Goya had grown that massive white beard or not, we get the sense that he's imagining himself in the figure of this sage who's still getting around on, not quite crutches, on his, his mobility aids. And he titles this one, "I Am Still Learning." At 79, 80, 81, 82, in poor health, completely deaf for the previous 30 years, and he's still learning. He has still got his eyes wide open. He is still enjoying everything he sees and jotting it down and making images like this one. Now, I'm not including in general Asian art, because in Asian culture, there is a much greater reverence for the very elderly than we usually find in Western European-inspired culture. But I do want to bring in Hokusai because of the fact that had Hokusai died before the age of 70, he wouldn't be remembered today. He made his great wave and his gorgeous landscape woodblock prints of Mount Fuji starting at the age of 70. His earlier work is not that memorable, and the thing is that Hokusai himself knew it. This is another work that he's doing right about the same time as The Great Wave. It's these ghost story images, these creepy, marvelous, scary horror works. So he, in 1835, at 75, published one of the most beautiful black and white books ever that he called 100 Views of Fuji. And he wrote a colophon to it in which he said, quote, "From the age of 6, I was in the habit of drawing all kinds of things. Although I had produced numerous designs by my 50th year, none of my works done before my 70th is really worth counting. At the age of 73, I have come to understand the true form of animals, insects, and fish, and the nature of plants and trees. Consequently, by the age of 80, I will have made more and more progress. And at 90, I will have got closer to the essence of art. At the age of 100, I will have reached a magnificent level. And at 110, each dot and each line will be alive." End quote. Unfortunately, Hokusai didn't quite make it to 110. He died in his 90th year, but right until the end of his life, he kept trying to penetrate into the essence of art. The Japanese woodblock prints were an enormous influence on French artists of the Impressionist generation, one of whom was Edgar Degas. And this is Degas' dance class, which shows his friend, the 64-year-old dancing master, Jules Perrault, but Degas was only 40 when he made this work. However, already at the age of 40, Degas was complaining about his vision. And in fact, Degas would suffer from macular degeneration. So as he aged, his visual field got more and more restricted. And so he too largely moved from paint to pastels and also to modeling in clay and in wax, because he could model a figure. And then if he wanted to paint or make a pastel of that figure, he could get right up close to it and kind of like see it out of the corner of his eye, which you couldn't really do with a model. So he develops in his late style this technique that is really, really tactile, because he's not really seeing what he's doing so much as feeling his way with the pastel sticks, running them over the curves of the racehorses or the dancers or the nudes that he was depicting in those years. And other artists throughout the history of art have had difficulties with their eyes. One of the most notable examples being his contemporary fellow impressionist Claude Monet. This is one of the rare surviving works from the period in which Monet desperately needed cataract surgery. And his cataracts were so bad, they were obscuring his color sense. He destroyed most of the paintings he produced in this period once he got a chance to look at them post-surgery. But you can see that this Japanese footbridge from when he was 80 is painted quite a bit differently from how he painted it at 59. So Monet did eventually have surgery. This is actually before the surgery, but he'd started painting this bridge in his Japanese garden, the water garden that he had built at his home in Giverny. He started painting that bridge motif in the 1890s. And you'll notice that in the foreground, there are water lilies on the surface of that water, that pond. Monet, after the beginning of the 20th century, really started to focus in on those water lilies. And they become his major late life theme. And during World War I, he adds the motif of the weeping willow reflected in the pond surface. So those vertical strokes that we see here are weeping willow. In these paintings, Monet equates the surface of the canvas with the surface of the lily pond. These are in many ways closer to Jackson Pollock than they are to Bouguereau or the 19th century academic painters that Monet started out his career in opposition to. And Monet became utterly obsessed with the water lilies. And after the end of World War I, the Great War, Monet wanted to give the people of France something for consolation. And so he designed an enormous series of water lily paintings that are displayed in specially constructed rooms in the Orangerie Museum in Paris, so that you can go in and be completely surrounded by water lilies. And they are still paintings that people go to when their nervous systems are jangled by world events and they need some of the consolation of nature. And Monet, as a gift to his nation, to all of us, created these works for that purpose. But it was clear to his friend Georges Clemenceau, at that time, the leader of France, that they would only get them for the state. They would only acquire them once Monet had passed away. He kept reworking them, retouching them up. They would only be pried out of his cold, dead hands. Now, another of the original Impressionists was Renoir. And Renoir's main theme is youth and beauty, as we see in his famous luncheon of the boating party from about age 39, age 40. Now, I love this painting. I love this Renoir, but I have never been a fan of late Renoir. He painted just sort of innumerable kind of sloppy nudes late in his career. What I didn't know about late Renoir, though, was that Renoir, by the age of 70, was so crippled by rheumatoid arthritis that he could not hold a paintbrush. His assistants had to strap up the paintbrush to his hand. You can see his hands in this photograph. And what does this elderly artist in constant physical pain paint? Does he paint his rage and his pessimism? No. Renoir keeps painting flowers and pretty women and nudes and all of the topics of, beauty, of optimism that had appealed to him throughout his career. This was what he thought art was for, to make pretty pictures, to make things that are beautiful and uplifting. Even though he was no longer young, he would keep painting youth and beauty. And the artist Henri Matisse met Renoir when Renoir was a very elderly artist, and commented, quote, "As his body dwindled, the soul in him seemed to grow stronger continually and express itself with more radiant ease," end quote. And that radiant ease is something that we associate with Matisse's mature work. Here Matisse is 42, painting these goldfish and flowers and just bursts of color. Matisse, though, was diagnosed with abdominal cancer during the Second World War in 1941. And he underwent surgery that allowed him to survive the cancer, but left him bedbound. And he could, he could use a wheelchair. And painting and sculpture had become more physically challenging for him. So Matisse invented a new technique. He, with the help of his assistants, he had them paint paper in brilliant colors. And then he would take scissors and create shapes. So this is a small work, but some of the paper cuts that Matisse created in the last few years of his life are enormous. And he would have his assistant, he would sit there in his wheelchair and cut the paper, and his assistant would place it on the canvas, and Matisse would say, no, over 2 centimeters and down 1, until it was exactly where he wanted it to be. But he called the last 14 years of his life, when he took up this paper cut, and here we see, there's Matisse with his assistant, surrounded by the scraps of paper that come from his process, but he called these works in this period a second life, saying, quote, "I have needed all that time to reach the stage where I can say what I want to say. Only what I created after the illness constitutes my real self, free, liberated," end quote. Holy rage? I don't think so. Picasso, his greatest rival, also lived a very long and productive life. So this is a portrait of apparently a 100-year-old man that Picasso made when he was 25. And this is before Picasso's Cubist period, before his great fame. But Picasso would continue to work and work and work into his 70s, into his 80s, into his 90s. This work is a work about loss. His companion, Françoise Gillot, had abandoned him. So he's looking at her portrait on his easel when she is no longer there to portray. In his later years, Picasso took up monumental public sculpture, like this one in Chicago. And as always, he was a dirty old man and liked to depict sexuality, the kiss here in 1969 at the age of 87, when he had married yet again late in life to, of course, a much younger woman. But Picasso would continue to paint his favorite subjects, just as we see so many of these artists going back again and again, artist and model, creepy old man and beautiful young woman, Venus and Jupiter and so forth, right up until the very end of his life. Now, in the 1980s, the Guerrilla Girls, a collective of anonymous feminist artists and activists, published this poster on the advantages of being a woman artist. Very ironic advantages, like working without the pressure of success. Seeing your ideas live on in the work of others and so forth. But included in here was knowing your career might pick up after you're 80. And in fact, this happened to a number of women artists. So Yayoi Kusama, who is still living and working at 95, has experienced her greatest success in the last 15 years with these infinity rooms, as she calls them, where she creates, you walk into these works of art. They are environments with mirrors on every side so that the lights that she installs in them look as if they are extending into infinity. And they are beloved by the selfie generation. Her exhibitions are often sold out months in advance. She's just unbelievably popular. Now, when we think of old women artists, the one who usually pops into our head is Grandma Moses. And if you're interested, I can give a lecture on Grandma Moses at some point in the future. But she's not someone who worked her entire life and then her career picked up after she was 80. She didn't start painting until she was in her late 70s, and then continued until the age of 100. And this is her tramp on Christmas Day, this memory of her childhood, this kind of Currier and Ives scene that gave so much solace to post-war America. To the Cold War, to the atomic age, that loved to look back on, weren't things so much better back in the day when homeless people were welcomed into our homes and given a good meal before they set off again. But as I mentioned, she's not someone who had worked an entire career and then got famous after 80, and neither was Georgia O'Keeffe, because Georgia O'Keeffe was quite famous enough in the 30s, but she would develop a new theme late in life. In her 70s, she started to paint her cloud paintings that were inspired by airplane travel, by looking down on the clouds, and these are some of her largest works of art. Unfortunately, like Degas and like Mary Cassatt, O'Keeffe would develop macular degeneration. And so this is one of her last paintings. She did take up pottery after she lost her eyesight, but this is one of her last completed paintings that she painted at the age of 85. And it's been suggested that this motif of the black rock simulates her visual field that was black in the center that she was only able by this time to see in the edges of her visual field. But she kept making art. Alice Neel is definitely someone who did the same thing pretty much her entire career, starting as a social realist in the 20s and continuing to paint images of people until getting discovered in the late 1970s. So in 1980, Neel painted this self-portrait, which is a view we don't often see in the history of art. Right about this time, she was also asked onto the Johnny Carson show, so she really had made it at 80, and here she unapologetically depicts herself, her 80-year-old body, which has given birth to 4 children over her lifetime, the breasts that fed those children, the ankles that held her up all those years, and she looks out at us, daring us to say the first thing about this work. Now, Louise Bourgeois became famous in her 70s. I think she was born in like 1912. So she was about 70 when she had a major retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. She had been working completely sub rosa up until this time, from the 30s onwards. In fact, a feminist artist in the early 70s did a feminist Last Supper with Georgia O'Keeffe as Jesus and various, it was a photo collage and photos of other American artists as the disciples. And the only photograph in the early 70s, the only published photograph they could find of Louise Bourgeois was from 1934. But she'd been working all this time, and then all of a sudden, in 1982, she skyrockets into public notice. MoMA asks Robert Mapplethorpe to make her portrait, and Bourgeois slyly decides that she will be carrying one of her earlier artworks, one that she calls Fillette, or Little Girl, for unknown reasons. But you can see that she's not having plastic surgery. She's just aging like a normal human being. But Bourgeois' so her eye benches are here in Seattle. They are at the Sculpture Park. That fountain that you see in the background is also a rather controversial late work by Bourgeois. But Bourgeois' most famous body of work, her giant spiders, were all made when she was in her 80s. So these works are homages to her mother. They are called Maman. Her mother was a weaver and a tapestry repairer. And so someone who ran a workshop, who cared for the family, who wove, and she imagines this as this enormous spider that she also knows is scary to a lot of people. So she's very aware that these, yes, for her, they may have very positive connotations, but that is not true for many of us. But her most important work, her most famous work, is from her 80s. Now, Agnes Martin arrived at her signature style by 1960, which was a 6-foot square canvas covered with a grid pattern of some sort. And Martin left New York City, moved to New Mexico, and just painted in solitude for many, many years. Again, to be rediscovered when she was about 80. And in her 80s, she made a couple of changes to her technique. She switched from oil paint to acrylic because it was more healthful, easier to handle. And she switched from 6-foot to 5-foot canvases, again, because they were easier for her to work on. But then, at the age of 91, she exhibited some works with triangles in them, a complete departure from all of this earlier work. And they look somewhat maybe like snow-capped mountains, but it's also hard not to see them as perky breasts with yellow nipples. But these only appear in her very latest work. Another artist who comes of age as an artist after 70 is Alma Thomas, because she taught public school for the first 68 years or so of her life. And then once she retired, she began to really devote herself to art. Now, she was already quite in touch with the mid-Atlantic art world. She was very much part of the Black artists collectives in DC. But it's really after 70 that she really refines her style as an artist. In this work, which we see on the left, she's reworking a Matisse paper cut work that he calls The Snail. But what she eventually arrives at are almost giraffe-like patches of color that for her, they've been likened to Byzantine mosaics or to pointillism, but for her, these are realist art, realist paintings that take on the countryside, the landscape, irises, tulips, jonquils, and crocuses. In this case, she would go out with a friend to where they were blooming, to the greenhouses and so forth. And one of my favorite of her works is this red azaleas singing and dancing rock and roll music. This is not what Kenneth Clark was talking about. This is a joyful work where she's playing with the size of those patches. She's a very committed abstract artist, but we get the density on the left, and there are some new shapes emerging here. And then as we get towards the right, they are less and less dense, as if a wind is sweeping through and beginning to dissipate the red azalea petals. It's just a joyful work of art. Our own Jacob Lawrence, hours for the last half of his career, was hired to do his first public work of art at 80. And so he began to work on this project for New York in Transit. And it's a subway scene with people of every age, every color, all smashed together on the subway. And it was eventually created and finished after Lawrence's death in mosaic under the supervision of his wife, Gwen Knight. But this is an artist who, for most of his career, worked very small. All of a sudden getting this big canvas, metaphorically, to work on. Now, Willem de Kooning suffered from dementia. And the only thing that he continued to love to do, that continued to put a smile on his face, was painting. So he had assistants who would, mix colors for him and put a paintbrush in his hand. And even when he was no longer verbal, he was painting these rather lyrical abstractions that there's a certain amount of debate over. Is this still a de Kooning? If de Kooning isn't able to argue with you about what he's doing, if he's, if he's not there anymore, but his eye and his hand still remember the painting process, is it still a de Kooning? Imogen Cunningham, her last project as a photographer was a series of photographs of people over 90, in which she included this photograph, even though Bobby LeBerry was only 83 when she made it. But Cunningham, who at the time of making this photograph was 92, wanted to see something that she felt she did not see in the 1970s in the public eye, and that was people continuing to live productive, happy, successful lives after the age of 90. And by making this photograph, she is doing exactly that. She is doing what she loved. She too was invited onto the Johnny Carson show, The Tonight Show, this year, 1976, which turned out to be the last year of her life. But no younger artist could have made this photograph. Just like no younger artist could have made those de Koonings, or could have made those giant spiders, or that staircase flowing out of the library in Florence. These are all the product of maturity. And in this case, it's only because it's an old lady behind the lens that Bobby LeBerry, who says no one but her husband, the tattoo artist, has ever seen her naked body, she feels comfortable enough to disrobe only in front of a female artist who is even older than she is, who understands what her body is going to look like and understands the love that she has for it and appreciates it. And I would say that these late life artists, when they get the fantastic opportunity to continue to work into their 80s and into their 90s, they're not characterized by pessimism. Quite the opposite. They continue to try to bring joy and meaning into the world. Thank you. So I apologize, I've gone a bit long, but I am happy to take questions if there are any, unless the room is needed imminently.
I was interested, the paper cuts that several artists that you showed, you didn't use the word collage. And I'm curious.
They are collages. But they are collages of a very specific kind, in which instead of starting with elements that are found, Matisse is making. He's creating the paper of various shades, and then he's making his own shapes out of them. So he's not going to, say, a magazine and cutting out pre-found objects. So yes, they are collages, but they're a very specific kind of collages. And Matisse called them papier découpé. He called them cut paper. So, yeah. And they're gorgeous. I see a question way over there.
How important is it that we know what the artist's prior work was when we see these things that are made in their old age?
That's a really good question. How important is it that we know what their prior work looks like? You could say that it's not important at all. And in some cases, the differences are fairly minimal. But I think it's also really interesting when there are differences. When Agnes Martin throws the triangles in after doing, horizontals and verticals exclusively for decades, or when an artist is changing his medium because it's an easier medium to handle with the physical limitations that come with that artist's old age. And it's not always old age. Like Chuck Close had a kind of wasn't exactly a stroke, but a debilitating neurological event happened to him, I think in his 50s. And it completely changed the way that he worked. But I think that if you looked at later Chuck Close without looking at any earlier Chuck Close, you wouldn't quite understand it as well. So that's why I tried in most of these cases to bring in sort of before and after images. Not all, but I think it adds to our understanding.
Do you know how old John Copeland's was when he did the self-portraits of himself nude?
No, I'm not sure I know this artist.
He's a fairly well-known in the photography world.
Oh, a photographer. No, I don't know.
But he made these portraits very intimate and very unflattering. I mean, it was very bold on his part.
John Copeland's, like Aaron with an S?
Coplan. S, maybe.
C-O-P-L-A-N-S.
I think there's an S there. Maybe not.
L-A-N.
I can't
C-O-P
imagine that I've called your attention to an artist you
that I
don't
do
know.
not know. I'm really excited about this. Wow, these are great. Let me see if self-portrait, hands spread on knees. Yes. Can you kind of see? No, I do not know this artist. Now I have to learn about a new artist and maybe incorporate his work. So that's, this is in the Tate. British artist apparently. Oh wait, this one's in the Whitney. Is he British or American? These are super cool. Let's see. Okay, this one was made in 1985. And what are they giving as a date for him? Apparently I don't have very good service here because it's taking its time to tell me when he was born. Fantastic. Thank you so much. I will look into this artist because he belongs in this, if he's over 70, which I suspect he may have been while making those images, he belongs in this group. I mean, there are a lot of artists who actually, there are a lot of artists that I kind of had to trim out. I usually start with like 100 slides and try to get it down to 75-ish.
How about some contemporary people?
Catherine Bradford showed recently at the Seattle, or at the Frye Museum. And she got her first big museum show at 80, or the year she turned 80. There was a Cuban artist named Carmen Herrera, I think, who died not that long ago at the age of 105 or so, who was discovered in her 90s, but someone who had been working, who knew Ellsworth Kelly and had trained in Paris and had just been working. Her husband was a New York City school teacher, and she just did her own thing for years and years and years. And finally, someone said, you should let me send those to a gallery. And then it exploded, and she was featured in the New York Times and had murals made of her work, and a high-end watch company made watches with her designs and so forth. Carmen Herrera. So she just died a couple of years ago. And there are a lot of, like Cindy Sherman, the generation, they all must be in their 70s now, of David Salle and the big artists of the 1980s. Well, that was 40 years ago. Those artists must all be in their 70s now, and some have become filmmakers or done other things. Some are still doing more or less what they've been doing their entire career. But yeah, would be. I actually have a lecture just on women artists making it after 80. So if you're interested in that, it's okay. So yeah, it's interesting. It's and it's just the persistence of plugging along with no recognition year after year after year to maybe someday get recognized. Not even, no certainty that you're going to get recognized after you're 80. You may never have any official recognition. Oh, right now, perfect example. Thaddeus Mosley, showing right now at Seattle Art Museum. I really should have incorporated him. So the show is called Following Space, Thaddeus Mosley and Alexander Calder. And when the Shirleys gave their 4 dozen Calders to the Seattle Art Museum, they also gave funds for exhibitions that would highlight Calder's continuing relevance to sculpture. And so the first of these compare and contrast exhibitions with Calder has gone to a 98-year-old, still active, Pittsburgh sculptor named Thaddeus Mosley, African-American, worked without recognition whatsoever, except in Pittsburgh. In Pittsburgh, he was a pretty well-known artist. He had some public commissions, and apparently once in the 1960s, he was invited by a gallery in New York to join to move to New York and become one of their artists, but there was no salary attached to that. Just kind of, you might make it big if you come show with us. And he worked for the Postal Service and had 6 kids, so he said, no, thank you, I need my steady income. But he kept sculpting in all of his other hours, and I think when he was 92, he was included in the Carnegie International, which is a big deal in Pittsburgh, and that was when he got gallery representation, and in the last 6 years or so, he has shown internationally. He's a fantastic example of this. Yeah. They are carved out of logs, and his goal is to make them levitate and dance. So in many ways, they're the polar opposite of Calder, who's using space-age materials and dangling them from the ceiling. Mosley is using these very, wood. He's carving logs, and creating, they mostly have 3 or 4 elements that slot together with gravity. They're all, he says that you can take them apart like Legos. But they balance, and some of them sort of visually sway or reach. He's very influenced by jazz. So they're abstract sculptures, but they're really, really interesting. And to see them next to the Calders, you can sort of see, okay, they're both animating the space around them, Calder by having things move through the space, and Mosley by having us move around the space and see how the works change from different angles. But that exhibit is there through June 1st. Yeah.
Thank you, Rebecca.
Thank you all.